You won't believe how a simple dinner with my husband's old friend turned into a night that shook up my whole world. It started so innocently, but ended up making me question everything in the quietest, most surprising way. And don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It all started so innocently, as these things often do. Just a simple dinner. My husband Tom had invited his old college friend David over. Tom had been excited all week, reminiscing about their youthful escapades, the kind of stories that make you chuckle even if you've heard them a dozen times. David was in town for a conference, a rare visit since he lived on the opposite coast. I'd met him a few times over the years, usually at larger gatherings, weddings, that sort of thing. He was always pleasant, a little reserved perhaps, but with a kind smile and intelligent eyes. Nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for that evening. Our home, the one Tom and I had lovingly curated over 30 years of marriage, felt warm and inviting as I put the finishing touches on dinner. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air, mingling with the fainter, sweeter aroma of the apple pie cooling on the counter. I'd always found comfort in these domestic rituals. The rhythm of chopping vegetables, the warmth of the oven, the creation of a meal to be shared. It was my way of showing love, of creating a haven. Little did I know that this carefully constructed haven was about to be tested. Let's say, Tom was already in the living room with David when I went to call them to the table. Laughter drifted down the hallway, Tom's booming, familiar, and David's a softer, more measured sound. When I entered, David stood up politely. He was a tall man, leaner than I remembered, with flecks of grey at his temples that hadn't been there the last time I saw him. His eyes, though, were the same. A deep, thoughtful blue that seemed to see more than you let on. "Sarah," he said, his voice a gentle baritone. "Everything smells wonderful. Thank you for having me." "It's our pleasure, David," I replied, offering him a warm smile. Tom's been looking forward to this all week. Dinner began like any other. Tom, bless his heart, dominated the conversation initially, recounting old stories, David nodding, and adding a detail here and there. I listened, interjecting occasionally, enjoying the camaraderie. I've always loved Tom's easygoing nature, his ability to connect with people. But as the meal progressed, I started to notice something different about David. Or perhaps I was noticing David differently. He had a way of listening, a stillness about him that was quite captivating. When he did speak, his words were carefully chosen, insightful. He asked questions, not just polite inquiries, but questions that made you pause and think. He asked me about my painting, a passion I'd rediscovered after the kids left for college. Tom had probably mentioned it to him. I found myself talking about my little studio, the way the light fell in the mornings, the frustration and joy of trying to capture an emotion on canvas. He listened, truly listened, his gaze steady and encouraging. It wasn't the usual polite nodding. It felt like he understood the nuances, the unspoken bits between the words. Tom, meanwhile, was happily tucking into his second helping of pie, occasionally interjecting with a proud, "She's really good, you know, but a real eye for it." It was subtle at first, this shift in the evening's atmosphere, like the air pressure, changing before a storm you don't yet see. The conversation veered away from the boisterous college memories and into more personal territories. We talked about life, the paths taken and not taken, the small joys and quiet disappointments that make up a life. Tom, still cheerful, contributed, but increasingly the dialogue felt more focused between David and me. Not in an exclusionary way. Tom was right there. But the connection, the current of understanding, seemed to flow more strongly between David and myself. It was disconcerting. And if I'm being truly honest with myself, a little exhilarating. I hadn't felt that kind of intellectual spark. That sense of being truly seen in a long time. Not that Tom wasn't a wonderful husband. He was steady and loving. But our conversations had settled into a comfortable rhythm, predictable like a well-worn armchair. This felt new. The nightmare, as I've come to call it, didn't announce itself with a bang. It crept in, disguised as genuine curiosity, a shared vulnerability. David began to speak about his own life, his work as an architect, but also about a recent loss he'd experienced, the death of his sister. He spoke with a quiet grief that resonated deeply within me. I'd lost my own brother years ago, and the ache, though dulled by time, was still a part of me. We talked about grief, not in hushed, uncomfortable tones, but openly exploring its strange landscape. Tom, usually so adept at navigating emotional waters, seemed a little out of his depth. He listened, his expression sympathetic, but he didn't quite join that particular thread of conversation. He refilled wine glasses, cleared some plates, his movements a little too deliberate perhaps. It was when David looked at me, his blue eyes holding a raw, unguarded emotion, and said, "You understand, don't you, Sarah? What it's like to carry that space inside you," that the first real tremor of unease ran through me. It wasn't just his words, but the intensity behind them. The feeling that he was looking directly into a part of my soul I rarely exposed. I just nodded, unable to speak for a moment, a lump forming in my throat. The warmth of the dining room suddenly felt charged, the air thick with unspoken things. The simple dinner was no longer simple. It was becoming something else entirely. Something I couldn't yet name, but I knew with a chilling certainty that the evening was far from over, and that it would change things. The subtle tension had now found a voice, and it was speaking directly to me. As I started clearing the rest of the plates, my hands trembled slightly. Tom was telling an anecdote about a fishing trip, trying to lighten the mood, perhaps. Or maybe he genuinely hadn't registered the shift as profoundly as I had. But David's gaze lingered on me for a moment longer before he turned back to Tom, a polite smile on his face. It was like a curtain had briefly lifted, revealing a hidden stage, and then just as quickly fallen again. But I had seen it, and I couldn't unsee it. The apple pie sat half-eaten, its sweetness a stark contrast to the complex, slightly bitter taste that was beginning to form in my mouth. What was happening here? And why did I feel a strange mix of fear and an almost forbiddance? Anticipation. The nightmare hadn't truly begun, but the stage was certainly being set. The evening wore on, and the three of us moved back into the living room. Tom, perhaps sensing my earlier disquiet or tired from a long week, started to yawn more frequently. He'd always been an early bird. He made a couple of attempts to re-engage David in lighter conversation. Sports, politics, the usual fare. But the deep reverence of our earlier discussion seemed to linger in the air, making small talk feel almost trivial. David was polite, responsive, but his attention, I felt, kept drifting back to me, not in an overt or inappropriate way, but there was an awareness there, a silent acknowledgement of the emotional space we had briefly shared. I found myself observing him more closely, the way his hands moved when he talked, the slight furrow in his brow when he was considering a thought. There was a quiet intensity about him that was both compelling and, if I'm honest, a little unnerving. It wasn't that I was attracted to him in a conventional sense, or at least I didn't allow myself to frame it that way. It was more a feeling of recognition, as if a part of me I hadn't been consciously aware of was being called forth. Tom, bless him, finally announced he was heading to bed. You two carry on, he said with a wide yawn, patting David on the shoulder. Don't let this old man keep you from catching up properly. Sarah, don't stay up too late. Love. He kissed my forehead, a familiar, comforting gesture, and then headed upstairs. The moment the sound of his footsteps faded, the atmosphere in the living room changed. It became quieter, more charged. The silence that descended wasn't empty. It was filled with the unspoken. I busied myself needlessly rearranging cushions. On the sofa. Would you like another coffee, David? I asked, my voice sounding a little too bright, a little too forced to my own ears. He shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on me. No, thank you, Sarah. I'm fine. He paused, then added, Tom's a good man. You have a lovely life here. It was a simple statement, yet it hung in the air heavy with implication. Was he contrasting it with his own life? Or was there something else he was trying to say? Yes, he is, I replied softly. We've been very fortunate. But even as I said the words, they felt incomplete. Fortunate. Yes, content, mostly. But was there a part of me that yearned for something more, something different? A depth of connection I hadn't realized was missing. These were dangerous thoughts, thoughts I hadn't dared to entertain for years. David seemed to sense my internal drift. Fortunate doesn't always mean easy though, does it? He said, his voice gentle. Or entirely fulfilling, perhaps. My breath caught. It was as if he had reached into my mind and plucked out a thought I hadn't even fully formed myself. How? Could he know? Or was I projecting my own feelings onto his words? This was the moment, I think, when the simple dinner truly began its transformation into something else. The politeness was still there, but underneath it a different kind of conversation was starting, one that was far more personal, far more perilous. I felt a tremor of fear, a primal instinct to retreat to safety, to the familiar. But there was also a pull, a curiosity, a desire to understand what was happening both in him and within myself. He hadn't moved closer. He hadn't said anything. Untoward, yet the intimacy in the room was palpable, almost suffocating. It was an intimacy of shared thoughts, of unspoken understanding, and it was more unsettling than any physical advance would have been. The nightmare I was beginning to understand wasn't going to be about monsters or mayhem. It was going to be about confronting truths about the complexities of the human heart, about the unexpected paths life can lead you down, even when you think you're safely on a well-trodden road. And as I sat there opposite David, the silence stretching between us, I knew I was on the verge of stepping off that road. He leaned forward slightly, not invasively, but as if to close a small portion of the carefully maintained distance between us. Sarah, he began, his voice low, almost a whisper. Can I be completely honest with you? Something I probably shouldn't say, but he hesitated, searching my face, perhaps for permission, perhaps for a sign that I wasn't about to bolt. My heart was hammering against my ribs. What was he going to say? A part of me wanted to stop him, to laugh it off, to change the subject, to pretend this wasn't happening. But another part, a stronger, more insistent part, needed to know. I simply nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was enough. The air crackled. The nightmare was about to be given words. When Tom talks about you, David continued, his gaze unwavering. He talks about your kindness, your loyalty, your talents. And he's right. I see all of that. He paused and I held my breath. But what I also see, Sarah, is a depth, a solitude almost that I recognize. A kind of searching. And I don't think he sees it. Or if he does, he doesn't understand it. My mind, Reeled, solitude, searching. Was I that transparent? Or was he simply an incredibly perceptive man? Or a more cynical thought flickered? Was he just very skilled at making women feel understood? But his sincerity felt genuine, bewilderingly so, the rawness in his eyes when he spoke of his sister's death that couldn't have been feigned. I don't know what to say, I managed. My voice barely audible. The room suddenly felt very small. The carefully chosen lamps casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the turmoil inside me. He wasn't accusing Tom of neglect or anything of the sort. It was more nuanced, an observation about the different layers of a person, and how sometimes even those closest to us only see the surface. Or perhaps they see what they want to see, what makes them comfortable. You don't have to say anything, David replied gently. I felt a connection with you tonight, Sarah. A real one beyond the social pleasantries. Beyond just being Tom's wife and Tom's friend. Did you feel anything like that? There it was. The question that hung in the air like a live wire. Did I feel it? Of course I felt it. It was a terrifying, exhilarating, confusing feeling that had been building all evening. To deny it would be a lie, not just to him, but to myself. But to admit it, what would that mean? Where would that lead? This was the precipice. This was the moment the nightmare began to take shape. Not as a sudden horror, but as a slow, dawning realization that my carefully ordered world was tilting on its axis. The consensual part of this unexpected experience was forming here in the mutual acknowledgement of a connection. The emotional depth was already profound. My personal discovery was kicking into high gear. I took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to steady myself. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked loudly, each tick a reminder of time passing, of moments that could change everything. What was I going to say? What was I going to do? The simple dinner was a distant memory. This was something else entirely, and I was right in the middle of it, with no clear path forward, only a sense of impending monumental change. I finally met his gaze, my own reflecting a mixture of fear and a nascent, undeniable truth. Yes, I whispered, the word barely escaping my lips. Yes, David, I felt it too. The moment I said it, a wave of something akin to relief washed over me, quickly followed by a fresh surge of panic. There was no going back now. The admission was out, hanging between us, potent and undeniable. David didn't smile, but his expression softened, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even vulnerability in his eyes. He simply nodded as if accepting a profound, unspoken truth. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged with the weight of that shared admission. The nightmare, it turned out, wasn't about him or some external threat. It was about the sudden, terrifying realization of my own hidden longings, the parts of myself I had kept locked away, and the unexpected key that had just been turned. The dinner party was over, but the real story, my story of an unexpected and deeply emotional unraveling, was just beginning, and it was already far more complex and unsettling than any monster under the bed. It was the monster within.